On the line with us is Dr. David Reichmuth, a senior engineer with the Union of Concerned Scientists in the Clean Vehicles Program. UCSUSA.org is their website. And his Twitter handle is Dr.Dave510. And Dr. Reichmuth, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Thanks for joining us. So you wrote this great op-ed about, asking the question, are electric vehicles really better for the climate? Yes, here's why. Tell us the science behind this. Why is it better? A lot of our electricity is generated with coal and oil and natural gas. I live in Portland, Oregon. The electricity we get comes from the Bonneville Dam. So, and my car is mostly electric. I've got one of those plug-in hybrids, the Toyota that. So I've bought, I think, 1 tank of gas in the last year because I can get 30 miles on a charge, which is pretty much anywhere in Portland and back home. But how is it, generally speaking, across the United States, how is it that buying and driving an electric car is better for our environment than driving a gas-powered vehicle?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I get asked a lot is it really cleaner? Because, we know that a purely electric vehicle has no tailpipe, so there's no CO2 emissions coming from the tailpipe. That's obvious. But we do know that, we do get some of our power from coal, from natural gas. And so how does it work out when you consider all those factors? And so what we did is we looked at all of the emissions from using a gasoline vehicle. So that means, of course, burning the gasoline, but also looking at the emissions from trucking the gasoline to the service station, refining, extracting, and transporting crude oil, and bringing it to the refinery. And then we did that same analysis for the electric vehicle. So how much CO2 emissions come from mining and extracting natural gas and coal, from burning it in power plants and delivering it to our homes, because there's losses in that process as well. So if you do that apples-to-apples comparison of where the global warming emissions are coming from, it turns out the average EV in the U.S. produces emissions equal to an 88 mile per gallon gasoline car. So much cleaner than the average gasoline car.
That's great. That's remarkable. The other thing that I didn't see in your article was the emissions associated with actually manufacturing a car. And obviously this would apply to a gas-powered car as well as an electric vehicle, an EV. But the steel in the car has to be mined as iron ore and has to be refined and turned into steel and then fabricated into the car doors and frames and bodies, and all the plastic in the car, the seat cushions and things, starts out as oil, and making the engine block and all the parts and transporting them around the world. I'm wondering if anybody has ever done the math on how long you would have to own a vehicle before, an electric vehicle that's, say, on average 3 to 4 times more efficient in terms of not producing carbon dioxide, 3 or 4 times less polluting carbon-wise, how long you would have to own and drive that to pay off the cost, the carbon cost of manufacturing it to begin with?
Yeah, that's also an excellent question, and we've looked at that. A couple years ago, we did a report entitled "Cleaner Cars: Cradle to Grave," where we looked at just what you were talking about, sort of, what are the emissions from making a gasoline car and what are the emissions from making an electric car? And what we found was that there are higher emissions from making an electric car than compared to a gasoline car, but mainly in the battery manufacturer. But that initial deficit or debt in emissions is quickly paid off as you use the electric vehicle because of these savings from global warming emissions as you drive on electricity versus gasoline. So it depends a bit on where in the country you are driving your electric vehicle, on how quickly you pay back that initial increase in emissions. It's in general about 1 to 2 years. So as long as you don't buy an electric vehicle and then send it to a junkyard after 2 years, we should be coming out ahead on global warming emissions.
Yeah.
And in general, it's about half even when you include the manufacturing emissions, it's about half the total lifetime emissions for an electric vehicle compared to a comparable gasoline vehicle.
Yeah, back in 1996, when I was writing Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, a book about, the end of the era of oil and all that sort of thing, I became concerned about basically the carbon cost of manufacturing a car, and I had a Toyota, or not a Toyota, no, it was a Toyota. I had a Toyota car at the time, and it was a really good car. It was a good, solid car. And because of that research, I kept that car until it had over 100,000 miles on it. And then I gave it to my son, and he drove it for another 40,000 miles. If you just change the oil frequently, cars will last a long, long time if they're well built to begin with. Is there a point in time where you have kind of not just, an electric vehicle beats a gasoline vehicle in terms of the added, or pays back rather, the added cost of manufacturing because, all the stuff we've been talking about. But is there a point in time where the carbon cost of simply manufacturing the vehicle starts to be diminishing to the point where it's not of great consequence any longer? How many miles should we try to keep our vehicles for, or how many years should we try to keep? I guess you gauge it in miles. Should we shoot for 50,000, 100,000, 150,000? I mean, what's optimal, or is there any math on that or any science on that?
Yeah, so there's a couple questions in there. One is sort of how can we make manufacturing of electric vehicles more efficient and produce less emissions? And I think that's something we can and are doing. And part of that's as we learn more about battery chemistry and making cheaper, more efficient batteries. Also, as we clean up the grid, and as the grid is getting cleaner over time, some of the emissions for battery manufacture come from electricity. So not only if we make the electric generation sector cleaner, not only do we make driving an electric vehicle cleaner, but we also making an electric vehicle here in the U.S. cleaner as well. And so, on the question of replacing, so it, in most cases, a lot of times when we're getting rid of a car, a gasoline car, we're selling it into the used market. So it's not, oftentimes it's not being junked. It's, so it's still being used. So we're not,
right.
And so it's not really like we're causing extra emissions for the manufacturer if it's we're selling that vehicle. And so we do recommend, I mean, if you can right now switch to a more efficient electric vehicle, that makes sense for the environment. Even if if you have a relatively efficient gasoline vehicle, assuming you're selling that and that's going to replace maybe a much older, dirtier gasoline vehicle down the line.